Okay, this is Reese. I'm going to be showing off a demo today of a project that I've been working on for a hybrid ARPG. I'll be showing off some of the systems that I've implemented and the kind of design methodology behind them. So let's get started. Okay, so this project, uh, the intention of this project was to build some systems that are as open-ended and designer-friendly as I could make them. The goal was to make it so that the designers could expand with the systems just in the editor, kind of as much as possible, uh, hopefully without having to ask engineers for additional functionality, um, which is something that I dealt with in other projects when I was working in the industry. Um, so to start off, I will be showing the ability system for the character. All of the characters in the game are considered entities. Um, every entity has an actor entity component on it that defines a number of things, like the entity's stats, as well as the abilities. So we'll be looking at the abilities. The abilities are all just contained in a list here. Um, the abilities can define an input definition, as well as a few options there. The benefit of this is that when the MVP of this project is available, um, players should be able to manually assign the keys, uh, for their abilities and things like that, um, which I think is really important in ARPGs, um, or just any PC game in general. Um, so the abilities can define a few things, like targets, what type of targets they will respond to. For example, I have an attack ability, and and you can't see or hear right now, but if I left click on, just something else, character won't move there. And then, if I left click on these blocks or enemies, um, then the character will go attack them. Um, the abilities, the actual behavior of the abilities are all defined in these ability data objects, and these are scriptable objects. These have been made scriptable objects to make it so that if designers were changing ability data, they won't be causing merge conflicts if the project is using version control. Um, they won't be making a change to an ability in the scene and then having everybody else have to merge that new ability data into their scene file. Um, the way the abilities are set up, they're set up um, uh, revolving around this idea of sequence steps for the abilities in order to make it, so that it can be really modular and expandable. Um, you can have any number of steps. You can have the steps loop. You can have steps loop in a specific order, things like that. So that could enable something like an ability that dashes forward and does a slam after dashing. Um, it could also be expanded so that while it's dashing, it's throwing fireballs off to the side, things like that. Um, the abilities can define an ability cost. That will be applied to entity stats on the entity that casts the ability. Um, these costs can be set up such that if the entity stats, can't, pay that cost, then it can't cast the ability. Um, you can have an ability time duration, so to make it kind of more open-ended, the ability could loop indefinitely for some amount of time. Um, and then also just has, like a timeout for graceful error handling, if that sort of thing happens. Um, like I said, the ability can loop, and this is just a default number. Um, and then also just some options for handling movement. Each of the sequence steps can define a number of properties about it. Um, the different types will kind of um, determine how the state machine handles the step, or certain things that get activated. Um, each step can loop as well, so you can have some more complex looping behavior. Um, you can do things like cancel movement uh, when the step begins, or cancel movement when the step ends. Um, you can determine, whether or not it should face a target. You can block effects. Um, I'll get into the effects system later, but essentially what this would be doing is if the entity has any active effects that are being processed, this ability can block that. So that would enable things like a dodge that blocks, say, new effects being applied. So essentially the character is invulnerable during the dodge, things like that. You can also block regeneration for stats, things like that. Set an animation, set the amount of time. You can also set up, sound effects. Um, then also some behavior on, you know, uh, how the step is determined complete, or just some like some necessary behavior, like trying to move the entity into range if it's attacking the target or something like that. The movement properties can also be defined. That can change things like the acceleration speed and the speed of the entity, as well as where it's moving to. Things like moving to the mouse point, moving to a target, moving to just some arbitrary point relative to the character. We can also define um, ability properties, and so and these are the actual effects. These are what determine damage that is passed to an entity. These are what enable the character to damage this block, right? And so I'll get into these right now. Um, these are set up again to be open-ended and expandable. Um, my goal was to not make any assumptions about what designers would want to do, but rather just to kind of open it up as wide as possible and try to make it, at least not just a huge mess to look at. um, so for abilities, for the ability properties, these can define things um, like, for example, in the melee attack, the character's sword has a collider on it. So it's going to utilize that for transferring the effects and determining hit detection, things like that. Um, it can also, you know, uh, not have to use that, but actually use a collider that is supplied by a prefab that gets spawned. So it can define a prefab to spawn, some, properties about the prefab scale and rotation. It can also define the spawn behavior. So it can determine the system will do something like um, if the um, if the prefab should spawn on the caster, or if it should spawn on the entity that was targeted, and also define whether or not that would be spawned on, the mouse click point, or on the actual, it will be parented to that target. Um, you know, so you could spawn, for example, a prefab that, does a poison effect uh, and in an AoE. And if you parent it to the target, now it will follow the target around. So you can have, a poison effect that spreads to other entities, something like that. Um, and then I can also define just some generic points that are relative to the entity. And so that could be something like if a boss had a meteor attack, and it needs to, cast 6 meteors around the boss. I can just define those points arbitrarily, um, if I'd like to. Um, I can, for the effect itself, I can map certain properties of the effect to stats that the entity has. Um, and I'll get into the stats later. Um, but for example, on the general effect, the stats can map to maybe the prefab scale or something like that. So if the entity has a damage or a magic boost or something like that, that can make it so that their AoEs uh, spawn at a larger scale or something like that. Um, so these are the actual effect data definitions. Um, they're just in an object, makes them easy to package up and send between different entities. Um, and it just has, the information to define the behavior of it. So it can determine, what type of entity does, or, yeah, they're um, all considered entities, I guess. Um, what it affects, um, and and the entity effect system is designed so that, you know, if it does not define the type of entity that received the effect, then it will be rejected. Um, so you can have an AoE that uh, provides healing only to your allies, or damages only your enemies, things like that. You can determine whether or not it affects yourself and allies, things like that. The How it is applied, uh, the behavior of like a buff or a debuff is going to be different from the behavior of just a plain effect. Plain effect will apply its effects once, and then that's it. A buff or a debuff will apply those effects, and then once the buff or debuff wears off, it will invert those effects. Um, you can determine the stacking behavior, um, and then some other properties about that stacking behavior. Uh, and then this part here is kind of what helps it be more generic. So the stats that entities have are kind of all available. Um, and this would be a part of the system where designers would just have to kind of use their judgment on what actually makes sense to affect. Um, but this effect can, affect any stat, you know. So if designers wanted to, they could have an enemy that when it hits you, it gives you gold, or it takes gold away, or something like that. Or you know, if it hits you, it affects your cooldowns, things like that. These stats also have um, additional properties on them, so you can target those specifically, like the base stat or the current value, things like that. And then it can also define a resistance type. Um, so in this example, the resistance type is armor. So you can see on this box, this gray bar here is the armor. Um, and the damage that the effect does, scales relative to the armor. As the entity attacks it, it damages the armor, and it's a little bit hard to see here, but it starts doing more damage to the entity. This entity is set to regenerate health, so um, it doesn't look like it's doing much damage to it. Um, and then you've got an effect value, you've got an application probability to make it whether or not the effect will apply every single time it attacks or not. Tick probability, you can set tick properties, how often it ticks, and the behavior of that, as well as whether or not each tick applies the full effect or a um, you know, subdivided effect. Um, and then for each individual effect, you can determine, you can map that affects value and some other properties to stats on the entity as well. So for the uh, melee attack, if I, which the actual damage is, yeah, so this 50 damage. If I wanted to make it so that, based on a damage scale stat or how much gold the entity has or something, the effect scales, then I can do that here in the mapping. And I can multiply and divide and subtract and things like that with that. Um, so, um, again, like I said, it's meant to be as modular as possible. So this is set up so that, if the ability could target um, the overall ability can target any entity. Specific effects in it could be like this melee attack will heal an ally if you hit the ally with it, or it will damage an enemy if you hit the enemy with it. Things like that. You can have any number of effects, so it could, you know, like this one, damages health, damages armor, and damages mana. So you can have all those sorts of things. Games like uh, the Elder Scrolls games, have these sorts of options as well as Risk of Rain, things like that. Um, yeah. Uh, so I'll just demonstrate some of the abilities that I've been able to build with just these uh, basic building blocks. Um, so, just to demonstrate the effects, we've got a damage health effect that, wouldn't be terribly useful, but, again, games often have something like, in the Souls games, an effect where you harm yourself in order to get a damage boost or something like that. Um, there's also a heal spell that's built out that costs some mana and heals player's health. Got an AoE, the targeting and the um, like specific display, prefabs, effects, and things like that for this AoE are also data driven and are expandable. So um, this targeting uh, could spawn any type of uh, targeting prefab. So that could have a different decal, it could have different VFX, things like that, um, and has different behavior on what sorts of targets it will accept as well. Um, so that's just a basic AoE. You can see that it just takes out the enemy. We've got a localized AoE. It's just on the character. We've got a kind of jump slam AoE. Um, and then a different movement system, jump slam AoE. The first one just uses a um, impulse applied to the rigid body. The second one actually utilizes the Navmesh agent, depending on if designers wanted a specific behavior. Uh, and then we've also got this is an invisible AoE that I think I named it kill, like the kill spell or something in Final Fantasy. Um, that just does a crazy amount of damage. Um, and then I've got a increased speed ability, decreased speed ability, um, and then this next one kind of showcases the looping functionality of the abilities. So this is the repeating AoE ability, and this is set up to loop uh, the steps, and so um, it'll loop from here. It's set to loop 5 times, so that means what will happen is you'll have 5 targeting states followed by 5 attack states. So that's just the AoE. You can see it like that. And so, this spell would be something like a wizard, flying up into the air and casting 5 lightning bolts or something like that. Um, and but it can be used in a lot of different ways, you know, and then kind of utilizing the different looping abilities. It could be that, each uh, time the player clicks, it actually casts 3 lightning bolts using, the loop here. Um, so things like that. I've also got a dash ability that costs mana, and then a just basic projectile. Just to show that a wizard could have a basic magic projectile or something. Um, so yeah, those are the abilities that I have just built using what exists. Um, but again, it's expandable, so a lot of different options for animations and effects and things like that. Um, and so hopefully able to create a lot of variety and interesting gameplay using just that ability system. Um, so I'll talk about the stats a little bit. The Each entity has stats. The stats are generic. Um, the way to kind of think about it is that uh, you know, from a kind of intuitive human perspective, stats are very distinct in what they are. Data-wise, they can be really generic. Um, and so the health stat object is just the same as a shield or a mana stat object. The behavior and how it is interacted with in the game is determined by just how designers decide to use it. Um, each of the stats can define, their base stat value, their minimum, um, their current, and some mob values, scale values, things like that. It can define whether or not it regenerates. The health stat on this entity regenerates, um, and then the regeneration, can be defined whether or not it's continuous, or whether or not it's on a tick um, per second. Um, Also built into this a stat group in order to kind of layer stats together. This would be something like in Risk of Rain 2, where you have an item that makes it so that you can um, have a one particular type of shield, and you can also have a health boost or something like that. And those all kind of function, in their own specific way. Um, so it's not just one big health pool with some complicated rules on what values get assigned when. Um, it's just meant to be simple in the way that it processes, so that it's so that engineering is not having to add a whole bunch of special cases for gotchas and stuff like that. So in this case, the group utilizes the shield and the temporary health, um, and the damage will be applied to the shield first, and then the temporary health. Um, the effects also can define whether or not they are whether or not they apply to a stat group or to a specific stat. This is because, in some games, you'll have something like a specific enemy with a weapon that can, you know, that pierces shields or something like that, to make it so that, designers can have some fun with, like, watch out for this specific enemy, because it can kill you even if you've got a lot of health or a lot of shields or something. Um, Things like that. Um, they've also got, have got the speed, armor, poise, gold is a stat, and things like that to make it really open-ended. Um, enemies could have a specific enemy could have an ability that slows your character down. that's really easy to implement with the effect system. Um, you can have an enemy that steals gold from you. Um, it can also affect your cooldowns. So that can be things like using a potion that resets your cooldowns. That can be things like your ally hitting you with a projectile that resets your cooldowns, things like that. Um, just to make it so there's a lot of options for fun things you can do in the game. Um, I think that's it for the stats. We're going to move on to the inventory. So the uh, prototype has a basic inventory. You can see here just some inventory slots and some slots for where to equip the inventory. The character can pick up and drop items and equip the items. The items can have effects that apply to the character, so that helmet added 1,000 hit points to the character, and so now it's just regenerating that. Um, if I wanted, I could also make it so that that helmet's effect uh, first applies a 1,000 hit point boost to the base stat, and then second applies a 1,000 hit point boost to the current, so that the character gets gains 1,000 hit points and then also fills that up. And so I can collect all of these items, and it's just engineering art. These are just sprites that were available in the project from assets that I had. So you can see that added a whole bunch more health. The character now has 4,700 health instead of 700. Um, these items also provide a damage scale boost. And so this enemy over here, its shields or its armor has been reduced. So this does a significant amount of damage per hit. Right, so now it's doing 450 damage per hit. This entity still has armor, and you can see that it's basically doing nothing. But as the armor decreases, then the amount of damage that gets applied increases. Um, so um, the UI system for this is also built to be modular to reduce some headaches. Um, so the uh, entity has an inventory on it, um, and this inventory defines, like items that it can have as well as equipment slots. The equipment slots are all in a dictionary, and they use specific keys to make it easier to link the um, equipment slot in the UI to a specific slot in the entity inventory component. Um, this can also define what type of um, item can be slotted to it. So that makes it so that it's easy to determine that, this helmet, for example, these are rings, can't be assigned to the ring slots. But it can be assigned to either of these. Um, it's also built to be expandable so that there can be multiple slots per equipment type to make it easier to add and remove things from the inventory. Uh, when I worked in UI before, it was very tedious and time consuming to have inventory system that was not built to be modular. Um, in quite the same way. So this means I can add any number of rings, any number of necklaces, any number of, you can have two boot slots, and the character can wear two different types of boots. And it's easy to implement. The effects will be applied using the effects system. Uh, there aren't multiple complicated systems that are kind of layered on each other, uh, determining how that functions. Um, So ideally, it's much easier to add things. You can add primary weapons. Uh, it has multiple slots for things like that. Um, and yeah, the abilities also have, options for being blocked by the UI, and uses the state machine for the UI as well as for the input. Um, and so that means, you can see when I move over the UI, the movement ability stops uh, being processed. And then it also makes it so that, I can click on things without accidentally, attacking an enemy under the UI and things like that. Okay, and the last thing I want to go over is the AI system. So the project has a basic AI system built into it. The AI utilizes the actor entity system, the ability system that I showed for this character. Um, and the difference is that the input from a player, comes from the player's mouse and keyboard input. The input for the AI entity comes from just an AI brain component that has just some basic sensors on it and just some basic logic. I'll be building that out more over time in order to make it more interesting and to add more functionality to it. So I've got this AI character here, and you can see that it detects an enemy and then will pursue it and attack it. It uses the same ability system, and so it could and it can actually, if I want it to, be controlled by the character or by the player the same way. So, I can make it so that they all, you know, move in tandem. Uh, this could, open up functionality to make it easier for controlling multiple units or for having an ability, for example, that makes it so that the player can take over an enemy entity or something like that. Um, but so yeah, it will detect enemies and then go chase them, and then if this block disappears, uh, then this one as well, um, it will just start to wander. Although it found another one, so it's wandering. It found another box, and then it will just continue to wander until it finds another target. Um, and then requires some bug fixes, but yeah. The goal behind that will be to make it so that AI entities are really easy to implement as well. That designers can use the same tools and systems that they are using to build the player characters and their abilities for the AI. Um, and then that the AI's behavior can be modular as well. Um, it'll be fairly easy for me to um, take to make modifications to the NPC brain component here. That's what controls the NPC right now. Um, to add things like different behavior states, intentions, looping behaviors, patrol behaviors, and things like that, without having to um, start pulling apart the ability system in order to make those things possible. Um, and so to make it so that everything can, uh, you know, it separates the concerns of each component better, makes it so that the components can be added, where they are needed, and enables better composition of components on the entities and things like that. So, and that's everything that I had to show. So thanks for watching.